I'm going to talk about property rights in institutional economics. And to give you a sense of where we're going to start out with a few definitions from different sources of property rights, that is. And then I'll talk a little bit about how this fits in with an institutional ecosystem and what are institutions and whatnot. Then we'll give a few examples of the kinds of things that might have property rights. And then we'll talk about the traits of property rights, like transferability, divisibility, security of trespass, and a couple of others. Property rights specify which resources can be owned, and by whom, and how they can be used. Another definition: a property right is a liberty or permit to enjoy the benefits of wealth, in its broadest sense, while assuming the costs which those benefits entail. It will be observed that property rights, unlike wealth or benefits, are not physical objects or events. They are abstract social relations. And then a last definition: private property rights always establish a relationship between defined individuals and defined assets, which can be physical goods, ideas, or people's own bodies. So property rights are inherently tied in with some kind of social contract, and that places property rights squarely inside of institutions, where institutions are rules, values, expectations, and enforcement mechanisms that structure human relationships. And of course, institutions are nested such that you have a societal level of institution where people form expectations about the government, about what rules will be legally enforced at the highest level, the values that kind of embody a society. But underneath that, you have organizations like corporations or schools or courts or whatnot, where they each form their own set of rules, values, roles, expectations that are only relevant to that particular organization. And this can go all the way down to the family level. So some property rights are defined sort of at the highest level and will be enforced at the highest level. Like if you break into somebody's property that they own, break into their home, that can be enforced in court. You can go to a trial based on that. Whereas like there are also property rights within, say, a household where two siblings may get into a fight over who owns the stuffed animal, and they may break the stuffed animal, or a brother may break into his sister's room and steal her toys. And those property rights are not going to be enforced at the highest level. Those property rights are understood within the family, and they're enforced within the family based on expectations, roles, and rules within the family. And of course, at the intermediate level, the same happens with organizations, that those organizations are going to protect their own space where they have creative control. So that's sort of the context where property rights are embodied, is in specific institutions at certain levels of this institutional ecosystem. And one of the things that goes along with property rights is the ability to have creative agency and productive agency and to create value where you know somebody else can't come in and micromanage or destroy the value you've created in that particular space. So property rights create boundaries within which people can exercise their creative energy, their leadership energy, boundaries within which people can fully own what they're doing. Now, it's helpful to have some different examples because when we first think of property rights, I think our minds tend to go to private property, like you owning a car or you owning a shirt or you owning your home. And those are fairly easy to think about, and they're fairly standard and simple contracts. But property rights can get more complex when you look at other things, like, for example, the means of production. So that might be a factory or a machine or a set of servers that are owned by Amazon, for example. But those means of production that I just gave, those are still physical types of property. You can also have ownership over a group of people. Like somebody who owns a church gets to set the rules, and expectations and values within that church setting. There's a group of people who may choose to come or not come, but within the walls of the church, the leaders of that church have some rights to set up their own mini institution. And of course, the same is true if you own a small business or if you own a mid-sized business. You have the rights to set the institutional values within that property that you own. And when you start to think about corporations and businesses, property rights become less physical and a little bit more social, in the sense that if you own a corporation, it's not just the servers that Amazon owns, but it's the contracts and the relationships between people who work at Amazon and the informational structure and informational design that is under the umbrella of the Amazon-owned thing that's really the key sets of property rights that organization has to spend a lot of time maintaining. There will also be shared property rights, like if a group of people collectively own a lake and they're trying to make sure they're not overfishing the lake, then an entire group of people has to collectively manage and collectively set the rules, values, expectations, and enforcement mechanisms over that lake that they own. And so, of course, the more people you get involved with ownership and decision-making, the more complex decision-making becomes. But the fact that this specific community owns that lake and it has the rights to manage that lake and the rights to negotiate among themselves about how to use it, that's still a property right, even though it's sort of a socially owned specified property right. In which case, one feature of the modern economy is that the nature of property rights have become more complex and in some ways less physical as we add more and more institutional structures that are sort of owned and collectively governed, and as there's more interconnections across the different organizations and institutions in society. Like, society naturally becomes more and more complex over time. So the nature of property rights becomes, it just also becomes more complex along with the economy. Because a lot of the stuff that many of these corporations own is institutional structures, social structures, expectations, contracts, rather than physical pieces of equipment. Let's look at some traits of property rights, starting with transferability and inalienability. This is so hard to say. This word drives me nuts. But of course, you may be familiar with this word from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What does it mean that a right is inalienable? Basically, it means you can't transfer it to somebody else, and nobody else can take it from you. So the right to your life, nobody else can take that right away from you. You can't transfer the right to your life to somebody else. So that's inalienable. The notion of inalienable rights is really important to protection of human rights. These are rights that cannot be transferred to another person. And of course, you can have transferable rights, which is anything that you own that's a physical object you own. For the most part, you can sell it to another person and transfer those rights to another person. Other examples of inalienable rights are your identity. Like, you cannot transfer your driver's license to somebody else. Or your reputation is also inalienable. Like, you can't give your reputation or give your credentials, like your degree from whatever college you graduated from, you cannot give that to another person. So that it's a type of right, you have ownership over it, you can use it as you see fit, but you cannot transfer it. And you might imagine in the digital economy, coming up with different ways of making reputation inalienable is going to be part of the task that people have when they're creating digital environments moving forward. Because of course, many digital platforms have done this. Like, you have a seller's reputation on eBay that you cannot transfer to another seller. At least you're supposed to not be able to do that. Divisibility. Can you divide a property right you have into many different parts? And of course, this is going to be what happens when a corporation goes from being owned by two people as a partnership to being incorporated, in which case you divide ownership of the company up into 10,000 pieces and sell that ownership to many pieces, so that essentially the corporation is collectively owned by that group of people. And there's a structure for decision making that sort of does point back to the owners of the company, but the ownership is divisible in these different ways. And of course, you can divide up your land property. If you own farmland, you own 100 acres, you could sell it 1 acre at a time. That's totally fine. But you can also set up property rights that are not divisible. For example, I sometimes use images, like pictures, in some of my videos. And I always use free images, but there is also a market for that. Like if I wanted, I could purchase an image. And one of the types of rights that's attached to an image is, yeah, you can own this, you can use it, but you cannot cut it up and divide it and change it. You have to leave it the way it is. So that's a type of property right that does not allow divisibility. And you might imagine with property rights, you can specify whatever you want to in the contract. You just have to think about how is that contract actually enforced. And does everybody who's interacting with that whole situation understand the nature of the property right if it's a little bit more complex than people are used to? The next trait of property rights is security of trespass, which relates pretty closely to exclusion costs. And of course, security of trespass just means how easy is it for people to violate the rights associated with your property. Like if you live on a piece of land and you have this beautiful garden out front, but everybody's constantly walking by and kids pick your flowers and whatnot, that's trespass. So you might have to incur some exclusion costs by putting up a fence or by hiring a security guard. For example, if like a lot of corporations don't want people trespassing on the corporations, coming in, stealing or damaging property, so they'll hire a security guard. And that is an exclusion cost that they have to maintain in order to maintain the rights that are associated with that property. And when it comes to security of trespass, the rights may specify who incurs the exclusion costs. Like it could be that some types of trespass are enforced legally, such that if you have someone trespass, you can call in the police, you can get the state to come in and incur the exclusion costs for you. Whereas other types of property rights, either the implicit understanding or if it's contractually written down, the explicit understanding is that you have the right to this, you can enforce these property rights, but you're the one who has to do it. The next trait relating to property rights is credibility of persistence. And in this case, you might imagine a corrupt government where the government may sell you a house, like you own that house. But if the government is so corrupt that they have a habit of coming along 5 years down the road and taking the house away and giving it to one of their relatives, if that's just a common occurrence, then even if you have those property rights, there's not as much credibility of persistence of the property rights based on sort of the meta-institution within which those property rights exist. And you might imagine with artificial intelligence coming on the scene, there are a lot of situations where people will sort of create intellectual property, put it out there, but they wonder, is there credibility of persistence of my right to this content that I created if artificial intelligence can come along and mix my ideas and my art with art from other places and sort of create something kind of like it. So credibility of persistence is definitely something that people are thinking a lot about in the digital age. And then there's clarity of allocation. Like, does everybody know who owns what? And is that even possible? Like with a lot of common pool resources, such as lakes or water reservoirs that people draw from, or even like a forest that's sort of next to a town historically that nobody fully owned the forest, but the whole town can go in and use it. A lot of times the clarity of that allocation is difficult or impossible to fully specify. Like if you own a portion of the lake, Do you own the fish that come underneath your property? Well, those fish could swim elsewhere, so it might be difficult to establish clarity of allocation. And it could be that in some communities, certain spaces, nobody really knows who fully owns it. There might be disputes over that. So clarity of allocation is another trait of a certain property right. Now, when we talk about these traits, sometimes they're written down. Sometimes the who owns what and what their rights are and how things can be used are fully specified in a contract. But oftentimes they're partially specified, or it's assumed that everybody knows, but does everybody really know? So these exist at different layers in the institutional ecosystem. Sometimes those layers are written down and official. Sometimes those layers are just plain understood, and that can sometimes matter for enforcement of property rights.